Welcome to our program. My name is Hoda Mahmoudi, and I'm professor and chair of the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace. We are located in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences at the University of Maryland in College Park. This program is being recorded and will soon be on our Bahá'í Chair's YouTube channel. Our program today features a discussion on how conflicts such as the current one in Israel-Palestine should be handled by campus communities and the need for a different approach with a focus on ensuring a deeper, more educated understanding of the conflict and how to continue constructive dialogue and how to build a supportive community. The program will start with a set of questions moderated by myself and Dr. Kate Seaman, who is the Assistant Director at the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace. After that, we will open the session for questions from our viewers. Please use the Q&A box on your screen to send your questions to us. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to our speakers today. I'm aware of how busy they are and how much of their time they have actually offered to the discourses on the current Middle East crisis. So I'm truly grateful that both of them accepted our invitation. Professor Bernard Avishai is visiting professor of government at Dartmouth College and adjunct professor of business at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He formerly taught at both MIT and Duke University. Professor Avishai is author of 2 books and contributes regularly on political economy and Israeli affairs to The New Yorker. He has also written dozens of articles for Harper's, the New York Review of Books, The Nation, and the New York Times Magazine. Professor Izzeddin Fishier is professor of Jewish Studies and Middle Eastern Studies program at Dartmouth College. He is also a novelist and a contributing columnist at the Washington Post. Before coming to Dartmouth, he taught political science at the American University in Cairo, worked as a diplomat, and since the Tahrir Square uprising, got involved in Egyptian politics. Before we begin the questions and answers, I would like to ask each of the professors if you would like to share more information about your backgrounds before we begin our session. Either of you.
Do you want to?
Go ahead.
No, I actually don't feel that there's anything more to add that would be salient unless I start talking and don't stop. So we can go ahead, and if there are issues that we feel our own individual experience has illuminated, then we'll talk about it then.
Okay.
I'd probably just say that Professor Avishai and I co-teach a course on the politics of Israel-Palestine, which is basically a course on this conflict. And although we agree on a number of things, we also disagree on a number of other things. And the path our lives have taken is also very different, and it shows it's like also a reflection of how people's involved in that story we're talking about today, how their lives diverged and converged. Luckily, in the case of Avishai and I, in a peaceful way, but in the case of others, not so much. And when we co-teach, not in the sense of splitting, not in the sense of partitioning the course, but we're actually teaching every session together. So maybe that's just a needed disclosure for the participants before they ask questions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. So I'll start with the first question. And it really has to do with our academic setting. What is our professional obligation as scholars when we face such challenging and polarizing issues?
So let me take a crack at that, because it actually follows on what Izzadeen just said. I've said this before, I've said it to the students, and Izzadeen knows I feel this way. He and I disagree on a number of things, matters of emphasis, at times questions of relevance, what facts are relevant, what aren't. But the one thing we do share together in our approach to this is a profound sense of tragedy about this conflict. And I don't think that that's accidental to scholarly responsibility. Because I think of the university as a tribute to liberal norms, liberal democratic norms. Universities like Dartmouth are a product of a liberal commonwealth, and fundamental to that world is an understanding that human beings are very limited in their perceptions. They're very limited in their understanding of the consequences of their actions. And if you don't have a sense of tragedy about politics, it's pretty hard to be a Democrat. And it's pretty hard to be a scholar. I think that, our students, our teenagers, people who are coming into university, for teenagers, the preoccupation is hypocrisy. But when you live a longer life, you become fascinated by tragedy. You become fascinated by people trying to figure out how to make the best of things and getting it wrong, and then getting it wrong, and then after careful consideration, getting it wrong again. That's pretty much the Middle East conflict. And so I feel like as scholars, one has to have a point of agreement here. And I think Izzadeen and I have certainly agreed on that. I mean, in the way that we deal with this in our class, and also in the way that we would expect other people in our community to react.
And I think Bernie means liberal and Democrat in the European sense, not the American use of those words.
Yeah.
And I want to add to this that I think the last time I checked, we are hired to teach. We're not hired to advocate. Our job is to teach, is not to advocate. And I don't know when did it become commonplace that university professors would be advocates and leaders of students' movements and so on. And that does not mean that universities are not places for advocacy. They are places where political consciousness of students and citizens, is born, and is manifested, and it's a good terrain where they kind of try it out and find themselves. But our role here in this, unless we are professors of advocacy, have a program where we teach them how to advocate, which I think in itself would be a great idea. But other than that, our job is to show them how to learn, and to show them how to learn and model it also, not just show them in the sense of explaining facts to them, but show them how they can build an argument, how they can unpack discourses, identify biases, find out, expand, question, look at other perspectives, all of the things that come with the learning, and then model in our engagement, model that also spirit of learning, and including in conversations about difficult issues like this. None of this includes advocacy. Accidentally, both of us are quote unquote public intellectuals. Both of us write our own opinions in, large scale publications, right? And one thing doesn't negate the other. But when we're teaching, we're not doing that. When we're teaching, we're not advocating. We are just teaching students how to learn. If a student is interested in our personal views for some reason, we direct them, go and read the New Yorker, go and read the Washington Post. And I'm happy to discuss my views with you as in the office hours. But the main job, the reason why the university is paying us money, is because we show students how to learn. And I think if we stick to this, a lot of the polarization that we see around us would be probably avoided.
I should just add, I had a long and very touching discussion with one student a couple of days ago. And she said, she's Palestinian and she said, this course didn't really change my mind about anything. It really, in some ways, confirmed ideas or thoughts I had before I came in. But, she said, I feel like my life has become a discussion. I just loved that phrase. Her life has become a discussion. I think what we need to model in the classroom is the dignity of reciprocal conversation, because it's a way of also modeling nonviolent disagreement.
Thank you. Kate?
Thank you. That's actually answered a lot of my second question. So I'm going to move on to the third question. And it builds on what you were talking about. So how can we ensure that discussions that we're having in the classroom or in other spaces are thoughtful and constructive, especially when the emotions are involved and the issues are so emotive that are involved? So how can we ensure thoughtful and constructive dialogue?
Izzadeen, you want me to go first?
Sure. Doesn't matter. I'll still have time.
Okay. Look, I guess I spent a lot of time at the Harvard Business School, and far be it from me to say that management issues are not important, but I don't think this is a management problem. I don't think there's a method or a technique that a university can adopt in order to manage the problem. Yes, what happened at Dartmouth was in some sense the product of people in various departments deciding that they wanted to get into dialogue years before this war. And that's important. So if there is a management idea here, it's don't wait for a crisis to start developing the kinds of relations in the faculty that will allow you to handle a crisis. But I don't feel like it's a management issue. I think it's a question of moral understanding and a sense of moral reciprocity. It wasn't an accident that Izzadeen and I decided to teach this course together. We were friends, actually. We were friends on campus because we have a common friend who introduced us years ago from the diplomatic world. But that wasn't the point. We both, in a way, spontaneously, in the same lunch, remember, Izzadeen, it was like the same lunch, and we both had the idea at the same time. I said, why don't we teach a course together? He said, that's what I was going to ask you. I mean, it was just like spontaneous. But that wasn't an accident. It's because we had, I think, identified.
We had an incident, Bernie.
Pardon?
But it was also because we had an incident. We were responding to something at the time, if you remember. That statement, the polarizing statement.
I remembered only vaguely because I feel like polarizing statements are like a daily diet,
At the time, this was a first polarizing statement that came out from some of our colleagues about the conflict in a previous round of those.
Oh, yes, that's right. After May of 21.
Yeah, and we thought, that this path, if this becomes a thing, then it's a problem because it's going to undermine the spirit with which we have been operating. And then we thought the best way is actually, some people wanted to issue another statement to counter the first statement. And our position was, no. If we go down this road, that's exactly what, the problem. What we need to do is to foster that spirit of how we approach the conflict. Yeah. And then we decided to co-teach together. And that was our response to what we saw as an invitation for polarization.
Right. But I have to admit that I thought of this before that statement. I thought of doing it, not that I just thought of doing it because I was teaching this course. I know you were teaching this course for several years. I was teaching it from 2011 myself. And I always felt slightly wrong about it. I mean, it's not that I thought I wasn't doing a good job. I just felt, no, there are certain ways in which I can make claims that would be so much stronger within a rubric where my claims are mediated by counterclaims. Or if I made claims that my partner in the classroom confirmed, how much stronger and more interesting it would be for the students to see that this is an issue about which there isn't any particular contention. Mm-hmm. I just think that, to the extent that people in the classroom can, as you said before, Zadine, model dialogue, to the extent that you can model it, it makes the teaching experience for students simply more vivid, more memorable, more credible. And I wanted that very much, particularly for this conflict. So the particular issue that you mentioned, I think, was just a kind of occasion for crystallizing something that was already, brewing. And I think if universities understood the virtue of creating team-taught courses about difficult subjects, they would be managing problems like this more successfully. But again, I don't think it's a management issue. I think it has to do with a stance that you have, a kind of moral, a priori moral commitment you're making to the virtue of that kind of dialogue and reciprocity, and in a way implying fundamentally that in advance that you simply don't have all the answers. You can't possibly have all the answers. And neither does anybody that you're talking about have all the answers.
I'd like to, go ahead, please, Professor Fisher.
I just responding to Kate's question, I think in addition to what Bernie has just said, it boils down to what is it that we're trying to achieve in a classroom? What are we doing exactly? What's our job? And that links up to what I said earlier. If our job is to learn and explain, then the place of emotions becomes just this. Emotions become part of what needs to be explained. But we're not in a classroom in order to display the emotions and follow them. We have to understand the emotions, we acknowledge the emotions, we also assess, in the case of a political conflict, we assess the role of emotions and how they guide the players and so on. But we are not here to kind of follow those emotions. And when we do this, we help students to learn and understand the dynamics of the conflict. And then they are in a better position to manage their own emotions, their citizenship role, their advocacy if they want, and so on. But I don't think we are particularly equipped to lead the students in managing emotions. I didn't take any training on this. I don't know anybody in my position who took training in this.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask a question, and I'm going to start with you, Professor Fisher. freedom of expression has been a major issue on campuses, even before this conflict. Yes, and how to express one's thoughts and views, especially on a college campus, but I would say anywhere. I wondered if you could comment about freedom of expression and the problems that that can lead to in relation to these very controversial issues and times.
Okay, so I think the question of freedom of expression has two sides to it. One side is more legal question, which is at which point freedom of expression becomes incitement, right? And again, I'm not particularly in a better position than others to educate that question. It's a matter for lawyers and administrators to ponder over and take positions about. And it's usually a trade-off between freedom and between the social responsibility, how far you want to go with the freedom, how much you want, and so on. And of course, it also depends on the climate. In a climate that is kind of quiet and laid back, you can afford more freedom, even if it's at the expense of. In a heightened and a tense situation, you might want to go on the safe side. But all of these are kind of other are legal and administrative questions. My take on it is more from a humanitarian perspective, let's say, and also from a political perspective. And not, legally, we are entitled to do a lot of things. Not all of them are good ideas. Legally, I can drink myself to death. There is no legal, I'm not going to be violating the law if I keep drinking until I die. But it's really not a good idea. It's a terrible idea. So when we exercise that freedom of expression, we might want to also think about the consequences of that expression we're making. By saying this, am I alienating somebody so badly that the consequences are far greater, the negative consequences are far greater than what I'm trying to achieve? And that's the personal responsibility part. And I invite myself and others to think twice before they say things like, what do you expect, how the others are going to perceive it? And what do I expect them to do with what I'm saying? So if I'm going to say from river to sea, or is it river to sea in English? Yes, from river to sea. And by it, I mean something that only a minority of people understand. The majority, especially the majority that I have in mind, the majority that counts in my mind, understand it in a very negative way. Is it really a good idea to make this my slogan? Is this what I'm trying to achieve? And that depends on what my goal is. Is my freedom of expression a call for mobilization and confrontation? Or am I advocating coexistence? So this is where both political and the human side and social responsibility come in with freedom of expression. The legal part, I leave this to the lawyers to go to the Supreme Court and kind of argue about.
Thank you. Professor Avishai, do you have anything to add?
Well, I suppose this ties back to what I said before about the nature and responsibility of a university. I clearly believe in the freedom of expression, and I'll quote you chapter and verse from Madison and John Stuart Mill and all the reasons why. That's not, for me, an issue. But I think there's an obvious line to draw, which is that tolerant institutions that base themselves on the principle of tolerance are not required to tolerate intolerant people. That is to say, if you get up in a university and call for someone's death, or you call for the death of a community, or you call for a kind of hierarchy of races. I don't even think that race is a thing, but the idea that you call on people to categorize a group of people and consider them not worthy of humanity. I feel like universities have no obligation to tolerate that kind of speech, because it's fundamentally contradictory to the principles by which we conduct ourselves at a university, the norms of a classroom, the norms of dialogue, the norms of nonviolent expression of diverse opinion. And I think that it's a difficult, I mean, Izzadeen's completely right. It's a very difficult row to hoe if you're in the administration and you have to make a decision. Is this really preaching intolerance, or is this just something that pisses off a lot of people? I would be very wary of, shutting down someone who's just infuriating. And when I hear someone say, Palestine should be free from the river to the sea, it's not going to win me over, but it feels to me completely defensible to say. I would never expect a university to shut down that kind of claim. But if someone said the massacre of 1,300 people was justified, or the killing of civilians in a cavalier way that has to do with violating the laws of war is justified, I would say, to me, that kind of speech does not belong at a university.
So there's a couple of audience questions that I think follow on from this point. So I'm going to read those to you. So the first is, what do you think is the most effective way for universities to handle conflicts between students or student groups in this matter, where staying silent may show that a university is allowing or saying it's okay for one group to mistreat another, while taking action may then show them to favor one side over the other. So what is the best way to find a balance between the two? And then connecting to that is another question that's asking, as a professor at one of the only schools of peace studies in the US, and indeed the world, I'm particularly interested in how to strike an institutional balance between defending the university's spaces for Habermasian discourse and acknowledging the normative foundation of peace studies as a field. So to put a fine point on it, at what point should a university, or perhaps even more fraught a school of peace studies, as an institution, take a stand against an injustice they have diagnosed?
I think the second question is for Huda more than it is for us, right?
And I think you should go ahead and start.
Again, I'm not a university administrator, so I approach this from my position as teaching faculty. And I see the campus as a place for learning and for growth. I don't see the campus as a place for primarily taking political positions. I understand that university presidents from time to time feel the obligation to issue statements, but if I were one, I will not issue a single statement on any political issue. Why? Because they are presidents, they represent that community in educational matter. They don't have jurisdiction over political issues, and there is absolutely no point, as much as the same way that professors have no authority to pronounce or lead kind of advocacy on political issues. I don't think university presidents have this authority. And the confusion comes from the fact that we deal with political issues in the classroom, or we have peace studies. It doesn't make us the International Court of Peace. It doesn't make us the main actor that brings around world peace. That's not. We study how peace comes around, how peace disintegrates. That's what we do. If there's a crisis affecting peace, it's a teachable moment. And our role is to bring students around this, different student groups, and use the fact that they're diverse, use the fact that they represent different facets, and make this a case where you see how these conflicts affect us, how people react in different ways, what we can learn from these differences, how this can inform each other. It's a tremendous kind of reservoir of lessons for us all, students and junior and senior learners. That's it. That's all. It ends there. There's no political role for us. You want to advocate for something, that's a whole different. You can do this as a citizen. You can do it on campus, but that's an additional issue. The main job is teaching, learning, understanding.
I think I agree with that. I mean, I would just throw in the caveat that, as I said before, I don't think a university president should tolerate the advocacy of chattel slavery, or, I think there are things that are so egregious and so fundamentally at odds with a liberal commonwealth. Yes, liberal in the continental sense, not in the MSNBC sense, is it? There's so many things, there's some things that are so at odds with a liberal commonwealth that to be a university president, which is a kind of epitome of liberal institutions, and to be indifferent to the advocacy for chattel slavery, the advocacy for genocide, or something like that. I mean, of course, a university president would condemn that kind of thing. But generally speaking, I think administrations should, as Izzadeen said, step back and let the definitions of things like, I'm contradicting myself, but let definitions of things like genocide, let that be debated with the understanding that it could become a contentious question. But some things are egregious, like, why would I not expect Robert Hutchins at the University of Chicago to condemn Hitler? Like, of course he's going to condemn Hitler. But otherwise, he should not shut down the study of fascism. I think it was Chekhov who said that the novelist's responsibility is not to condemn theft, but to tell you how a thief feels. There's a lot that goes on in the university that can be mistaken for advocating theft, when really what professors should be trying to do is tell you how a thief feels.
Next question, Kate.
So the next question is, it's refreshing to hear you articulate the role of the professor as an experienced instructor and not as an advocate of a given worldview. What is the role of historical perspective in assisting students to develop and articulate their own perspectives on contemporary issues, including the Israel-Palestine crisis? And do you believe that such a long view of world affairs helps us rise above simplistic binaries that contribute to us versus them discussion?
Short answer is absolutely, of course. ABC, if we're teaching something, any conflict has a history, has a context, and in fact, every single conflict has histories, and our job, if we want to understand the conflict, is to also learn about those histories and narratives and how they sometimes converge and sometimes overlap and sometimes they live in different planets and so on. And what does that mean? And how does this affect the conflict? And everything is history is not just something that ended. History continues. And Of course, we have to have, this is, I think, unavoidable if we want to understand the dynamics of any conflict.
But I also want to reinforce this idea that to teach with historical perspective means telling the story from the subject forward and not from the present back. In other words, to do justice to historical context, to do justice to the historical perspective, is to recognize that the people who acted in history did not have our knowledge of what happened. And so it's our responsibility to try to put students into the shoes of the people at that time and understand their limitations and their aspirations and their difficulties and their hubris and their narcissism and all the other things that go along with being a human being. And the worst way to impose historical context is to say, oh, that happened, therefore you must have willed it. No, in most cases, things that happen, consequences that we live with, are not the result of people willing those consequences. It's childish to say, it's like, you know, someone gets hit by a car and the kid says, Mommy, why did that guy want to get hit by a car? I mean, it's childish. That's childish history. What you have to do is understand how people make their way, how people muddle through the things that mattered to them, the problems in history they were trying to solve. Which, you know, because when you make history, you kind of back into it because you're always trying to solve the problem that came before you, and you're sort of backing forward into history. That takes a lot of work on Izzadeen and my part. That takes a lot of work to put ourselves in the mindset of a Palestinian peasant during the time of the Ottoman land law reform, or of a Jew in the Pale of Settlement, trying to come to terms with, you know, the fear of Judaism evaporating in a liberal assimilation project. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons why people do things. And we have to help them understand that with some compassion, or we're not doing justice to history at all.
Thank you. So for the next question, I'm going to combine three that overlap, if that's okay, and I'll try and form it into one coherent question. So how do you think generational differences between faculty and students and among faculty in perspectives should be incorporated into teaching? Because there has been a call made by some to not dismiss the seemingly misinformed statements of younger people. So then following from that, how do you support students in understanding and distinguishing the difference between anti-Semitic rhetoric and critiques of Israel and the actions of the Israeli state? And then the final part of the question, we've seen many faculty around the country doxing and advocating for limiting student speech when students have advocated for one community or another. How do you think faculty or faculties as bodies should engage with peers who cross the lines of constructive/safe community discourse in ways that threaten students? Hopefully that's not too much bundled into one.
Izzadeen, why don't you go first? I feel like you're the sapper. You're the one who falls on the barbed wire, and then I crawl over your back.
Look, I don't want to lose anybody. I have like almost a priest attitude towards our students and everybody, to be honest. I don't want to lose anyone, and I don't want to. So this is why I want to bring anybody with any discourse, as long as that person is willing to listen and discuss and maybe think and reconsider. That's all I'm asking for. So we had a couple of forums at Dartmouth, and when this happened, and somebody asked about, how do we explain the Hamas attacks? Where does this come from, and so on? And then we started to explain the context, and others were furious that we're talking about the context, as if, how dare you basically justify this? And my response is not to chide those students or faculty or people. My response is not to dismiss them or to denounce them or to tell them how wrong they are. My response is try to explain the difference between actually understanding and explaining things and between justifying and condoning things. And that's, again, for me, it's a teachable moment. And I prefer that the students say what they think so that I have an opportunity to make a case than if they remain silent because they fear the consequence. And therefore, they keep it in, and it kind of ferments and then turns into a bigger problem for all of us a little bit later. And that's what safe space means. That's why, I encourage, not just in Arab-Israeli conflict, I teach other things about Middle Eastern politics. And I encourage students, I tell them, I want you in this classroom to put the political correctness rope outside. If you want to say Islam is a problem, you think it's a problem, let's discuss that. Say why, how would it be a problem in the view of others, and how people would, say it is not. If you think, whatever you are thinking, I want your thoughts here. Bring them, air them, so that we can have a smart, useful conversation about it that teach all of us something. And I think that's what universities are for. It's a safe space for that. So I'm willing to take some of the excessive things, as long as Bernie said, the people who express them are willing to engage in a conversation. If it's threats of physical action, that's a whole different story. That's for the safety and security people to deal with. But as long as people are willing to engage in a conversation, regardless of their background, political ideas, whatever, I'm happy to engage in this conversation. That's my job.
Right. And Izzadeen just triggered a thought, something I meant to say before and forgot. I said that this isn't a management problem. There's one way we did think of this as a management problem, and that was we divided up our students into 6 different teams.
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt. I have to interrupt because people are asking, what is the class that you teach? And then that's a good place to pick up on the division.
It's called The Politics of Israel and Palestine.
Okay, so please go ahead.
The history and contemporary issues of the Palestine-Israel conflict. And we got, a very diverse class. But one thing we did do in the beginning of the year, we divided up the class into teams, and every reading assignment, we asked the team to post a single answer, because we knew that would mean that some diversity of opinion would be forced to have a conversation before every class, which means that 18 times or 20 times they met and they became friends. It's a little, when you're working on something like this, you can't help but talk things through and humanize each other. And if you run into a problem, you have to resolve that problem. So there was something in the method of the class, I do think, that had a very good result, that students were forced is not the right word, but invited to learn the humanity of someone who has an opinion different from themselves. So by the end of the year, it felt natural for them to see the virtue of dialogue. There was a kind of sympathy already, simply in the transactional nature of the assignment. So I would strongly urge teachers who have difficult subjects, not Israel-Palestine, socialism versus capitalism, I don't know, just have as much as possible occasions for students to reconcile their ideas regarding a particular reading. There isn't that much at stake when it's a question of what do we make of this reading, but what is at stake is implied, which is the humanization of the other.
Building on that a little bit, are there specific issues or topics that you have found helpful to address in the classroom to generate constructive dialogue in relation to the present conflict? And then connected to that, are there any specific ways or tools that you have used to help students focus on the learning aspect and maybe kind of putting aside emotions in the classroom, especially again when we're talking about such difficult situations?
Well, what Bernie just said is a main tool. You know, putting them in teams and getting them to respond collectively to things. At one point, we also used role modeling, where we asked students to actually, I think that was maybe before October 7, we were talking about Gaza and the siege, the closure around Gaza. And then we asked students who we guessed were more pro-Palestinian to play Israel and tell us what would it take for them as Israel to allow freedom of movement in and out, what they think is the vital or are the vital conditions for this to happen. And then we asked others to play Hamas and others to play, and so on. And it's pretty annoying for students to do that. Especially, you know, the stronger they feel about it, the more annoyed they are. But, and sometimes they tend to buy caricature responses, but with time, it works. And they, you know, I think to achieve empathy is a wonderful goal. And if we get it, that'd be great. But even if we don't get it and we just get a simple understanding of the logic of the others, a simple understanding of how the other sides think, what their concerns and motivations are, I think that's a huge step forward from taking positions, blaming, and so on.
And do you establish, sorry, I'm just going to follow on quickly. Do you establish any rules at the beginning of the course for the students in the classroom? Anything like that?
We established kind of general rules at the beginning about, you know, first session, Bernie was asking them about, you know, the media and all the impact that the media has. We talked about emotions and backgrounds and stereotypes, and we talked about what we're trying to do in this classroom. You know, how is learning different from advocacy and from all the other issues? And again, we were tragically lucky because that happened before this round of conflict. So it didn't look like we're responding. This was just this is how we go about it. So when the conflict happened, when the attacks happened, and then the bombing of Gaza started, we had a discussion, and the students were actually a lot better in the way they handled this discussion than the average students on the same campus. And just because we were already in this quote unquote workshop, if you want.
That's right. That's right. And you know, you actually alluded to the thing I was just about to say, which is at times in the class, we did raise sort of stereotypical epithets and ask the students to struggle with them. What does terrorism mean? What does apartheid mean? What is BDS? What does it achieve? What, you know, what is the value of adopting that position?
Colonialism and settler colonialism and all of that.
Settler colonialism, exactly. Like there are all kinds of epithets and stereotypes getting thrown around, buzzwords that get thrown around. And I think what we had figured out how to do is, you'll excuse the expression, problematize these these ideas. Like as soon as you double click on any of them, you discover how shall I put this, how partial they become and how they melt away. Because I think a lot of what makes for anger on campus is sort of what makes for anger when, you know, husbands and wives are fighting. Like, you're always this, you know. You know, no, if you simply unpack what is meant by these stereotypical phrases, you realize that there are so many dimensions in which they don't exactly fit. They never quite fit, and they may be useful in exposing all the complex ways they don't fit, and that itself becomes a teaching experience, a teaching moment. But if you can't default to an angry epithet, you're not going to be angry. You'll be sad because there's a lot to be sad about, but you're not going to be angry.
Or at least channel the anger somewhere more useful than just shouting.
Right.
Absolutely. So the next question is, I often hear arguments and conflicts grounded in foundational differences in how we understand and articulate issues. For example, something that one party sees as violent and not to be tolerated might also be seen as legitimate expression reflecting lived experience. Can you comment on how we can approach this situation? And then I'm going to tack on another piece to that as well. How important is it in these situations to humanize the other side in such a conflict?
I feel like we sort of answered that in many ways already. Don't you, Izzadeen? I mean, is there anything to add to that? I'm not quite sure.
Not much. I just want to say, you know, my background is more because I come from diplomatic work, and so I am less reliant on things like the merits of dialogue and humanizing and so on. I mean, those for me are lofty goals. I hope they work, but I don't rely on them. I rely on more kind of hard distinctions. Like, what are we here to achieve? What is our job? So it's not, you know, we're here to understand. If you want to understand, you have to put yourself also in the shoes of multiple players. You can't understand anything by just looking at it from one angle. It doesn't work in anything. It doesn't work in science. It doesn't work in, you know, complex human conflicts. So simply, that's the job. You want to learn, you have to learn to look from different perspectives. Here, we're trying to understand dynamics of conflict. We're not here to decide who's right and wrong, because guess what? You're not going to educate, you're not the judge. As a citizen, you can have your own positions, but that's in order to have an informed position, you have to be informed. Therefore, you have to learn. So that's what I focus on. A byproduct, but that depends a lot on the student or on the person. A byproduct of learning with the sophistication, with the complexity, is empathy. But it might not come, and that's fine, as long as the basic job is done, which is understanding how the conflict. I want the student at the end to be able to tell me, if I ask them, would this be acceptable to a Likud government? Would this be acceptable to Hamas? Can you have a ceasefire under those conditions, or is it not attainable? To answer those questions. Those are analytical questions. They have nothing to do with our preferences. That's my job. That's what I want them to get.
Last year, we did do one thing we couldn't do too much this year, which was to invite an array of different guest lecturers, and not lecturers, people who would submit themselves to the questions of the students. So we brought in Ehud Olmert from Israel. We brought in, on Zoom, of course, We brought in Amr Aker, who was the chairman of Paltel, the Palestinian telecommunication. It was useful, I think, for students, and I'd like to continue doing this next year. We did less of it because of the war. It just felt wrong to bother people to talk to 20 students when they're in the middle of a war. But in future years, I think it is a way of helping students see the humanity on each side, just to see more humans.
Could I add something to this? Sure. When we invited Ehud Olmert, who was prime minister in 2006 during the war in Lebanon,
right.
One of our students had a family member who was killed by the Israeli bombing of South Lebanon. So he was discussing with us before the session, how to talk about it with Olmert, and he basically wanted to kind of show Olmert how wrong he was, and so on and so forth. And over a number of discussions, we got the student to focus on what actually he can learn by discussing with Olmert. What was the rationale behind his decision, rather than chide him for his awful decision, but just to understand what led to that and so on. And this didn't take away from the emotions the student felt towards Olmert, and it didn't sanitize the meeting, because ultimately Olmert felt what was behind the question and got a bit defensive also. But this was instructive. The exchange went, and that instead of like a student walking out, let's say, or raising a banner, you're a war criminal, and then moving out, we had this discussion that was tense and difficult, but I think everybody learned from it, including, I hope, Olmert, but definitely the student and the rest of us. So this is what I mean, more than, love your neighbor and, humanize and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'm aware that we are slightly over time. I think there's one more question I'd like to ask, if that's okay. And that is, how can people make sure that the information they're consuming in times like these is accurate? Because there's obviously so much disinformation out there. So how can we guide people to good sources of information?
Get off TikTok and all the rest of it. Just get off that stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, there are news outlets that have fact-checking mechanisms built in. So maybe they're not, none of those news outlets is objective. They're all biased, but you can maybe even it out. So read the New York Times, read Haaretz, and read Arab news agencies that are reputable for accurate, and then see, even out the biases. But just stay out of unsourced, undocumented pieces of information, quote unquote information. That's it.
Yeah, I just want to endorse that. I mean, we both write for magazines that have real fact-checking, newspapers, magazines that engage in curation, fact-checking, editing, all the things that we used to rely on to make something that's in the public realm credible. Democratization of information does not mean
making up information.
Pardon?
It doesn't mean make up information.
It doesn't mean that your imagination is as true as a curated article. And I must say, I just can't resist saying, it really irritates me that the social media platforms don't teach their algorithms to privilege curated articles. It just seems the most obvious, natural thing in the world that if your algorithm is going to point to you, if the algorithm is going to point to you, you have to demonstrate that you have fact-checking capability. It's different to write for The Economist or just write a blog. And don't believe anything. That's my rule of thumb. Don't believe anything that hasn't gone through a demonstrated process of curation and fact-checking.
Are those the end of the question session? Thank you, Kate, very much for moderating those. Thank you so much, Professors Avishai and Frischier, for a very, very constructive session. I think there's a lot there that we have to go back and visit and reflect upon, because you have said many important things for those of us in academics who would like to navigate difficult times like these. And I want to remind our viewers again that this session is being recorded, and it will be on our YouTube channel probably by next week. So we encourage you to please go there and watch this session again. But you have provided us with very important information about the values of scholarly engagement and intellectual consideration. And I think moving forward, some of the points that you shared with us are very important for us to keep in mind, as I'm sure we will have many other issues to deal with beyond this one. So it's really an honor to have both of you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Huda, and thank you for world peace.
I was going to tell Izzadin that at the Baha'i Chair, our work is cut out for us. We try to look for all the barriers to peace and how to remove them by engaging scholars like you to help us understand. And I think we will be doing that for the long haul.
Best of luck with it.
Thank you. Our next event, if I can just announce it, will be in February, which is during Black History Month. We are featuring Professor Robert O'Mealy from Columbia University. He is the Zora Neale Hurston Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia. And he's written a fabulous book, which he'll discuss. Love, Jazz, and Antagonistic Cooperation. So we really encourage you to join this wonderful discussion and lecture on February 13. It should be 2024, a new year, at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you for joining us today. It was very, very nice that you could join us. And again, thank you to our participants. All right, bye-bye.